So this is the first movie on pivot tables, the introduction of pivot tables. And because you're watching this, I don't feel a strong need to sell you on pivot tables, but I do want to say this. Putting the effort into learning pivot tables is well worth it. It's a whole lot easier to do aggregating and produce a summarized dynamic chart or schedule of your data using a pivot table than using functions and formulas. Having said that, we're going to create a pivot table. We're going to go over the parts of the pivot table field list. We're going to add fields to the drop zone. We're going to remove those fields, and then we're going to delete the pivot table. So pivot tables. I've got some data that I sort of generated, I made up. And we're going to use this data to produce a pivot table with. And there are some important aspects of this data that we're going to cover in a subsequent movie if we're going to use it to produce a pivot table with. But for now, we're just going to select a cell in that region, go to the Insert tab in the Tables group, and left-click Pivot Table, where now we have to make two choices. We've sort of already made one of the choices, and that is to select a table or range that we're going to use as the data source. An alternative would have been to select an external data source, which we're also going to cover in a subsequent movie. The second decision we have to make is, do we want to produce this pivot table on a new worksheet or in the existing worksheet? And if we want to create it in the existing worksheet, where do we want it to be created? I'm going to pick cell J5 on the existing worksheet and left-click OK. And Excel creates for me a pivot table, Pivot Table 1. It's the default name that's assigned, just like if you add a worksheet to a workbook, it'll sequentially assign a number to each of the sheets, naming them sheet 1, 2, 3, etc. And same thing with workbooks. So we have a pivot table, but there's no content in the pivot table. The way we add content to the pivot table is to use the pivot table field list. The pivot table field list is docked on the right side of the workbook, but we can pull it away from the side and move it around if we want to. And to redock it, just slide over the boundary at the edge of the monitor. If you have Windows 7, if you don't, you may have to resize it to get it to its original position. We also have some options as to how we display the pivot table field list. On this drop-down menu, the default is the selected option, where on the top we have the list of fields, and below the list of fields we have the drop zones. But we can rearrange this by having the list of fields on the left side and the drop zones on the right. We can have just the field selection options. We can have just the drop zones, and we can have the drop zones listed in a different order. But I'm going to go back to the standard display and talk about the different components of the pivot table field list. The list on the top are the list of fields that we can add to the pivot table. They are the column headers for our data that we selected when we created the pivot table. The drop zones, and there are 4, beginning with, on the upper left-hand side, the report filter. To the right of that, we have column labels. Below the report filter, we have row labels. And finally, we have values. On the bottom of the pivot table field list, we can check this box to defer the layout update. And when we do that, this button is activated. And when we click it, the pivot table will update for the choices that we made. You would want to use this, or you might want to use this if you have a tremendous amount of data and it takes a long time for the pivot table to update. It's similar to manual recalc on your worksheets. But I'm going to clear that checkbox for now so we can see the pivot table automatically update as we drop fields down to the drop zone. So there are a number of ways to get the fields down to the drop zone. You can click the checkbox near the field, and when you do that, a non-numeric field will be added as a row label, and a numeric field, and the division is numeric, will be added to the values field. So we've created sort of a meaningless pivot table at this point where we have summed the values of the division by month. Once you get the fields down into the drop zone, you can grab them and move them to a different location. So I moved the division field to the column labels. And when I did that, the pivot table created in row 6 column headers that begin in column K and continue in L and M of an amount that's 1, 2, and 3 for each of the divisions. And the row labels that we created by checking the checkbox for the month are listed in rows. So I've identified the structure or created the structure of the pivot table. Now I can add sales dollars if I want to, and when I left click a value field, as I said, the field will be added to the values drop zone. Pivot tables are all about selecting data and aggregating that data. We so far have identified column labels, row labels, and the value that we want to, in this case, sum, which is the sales. But we can also create nested aggregations by adding another field value to the row label. And let's do that by adding salesperson below month. When I do that, month is the major category and the subcategory is salesperson. The totals for each of the months are at the top, and you can change all of these things, and we're going to do that in a subsequent movie as well. So in January, for Division 1, I've got $147. Division 2 is $440. Division 3 is $161 for a total of $748, broken out between the 3 salespeople, Jimmy, Mike, and Rob. If I decide that I would rather show this information by the salesperson and then broken out per month, I just need to move the position of month and salespeople, just reverse the order. I now have the sales aggregated by salesperson per month. As I add fields, the checkboxes near the field list are automatically checked, whether I check the box directly or I drag the field down into the drop zone. So when I clear that checkbox, the field is no longer displayed in the drop zone. And I can, instead of sales, choose quantities. And again, since it's a numeric field, Excel automatically adds it to the value drop zone. I can also grab the field and drag it back up to the field list. And to get rid of the pivot table, to delete the pivot table, in Actions, left-click Select, left-click Entire Pivot Table, and press Delete. So that was an introduction to pivot tables. To create a pivot table, select your data, and one cell in the region is good enough. Go to the Insert tab, and in the Tables group, left-click Pivot Table. We'll then have 2 decisions. One of them sort of has already been decided as to whether we're going to use the data in the workbook or an external data source. And secondly, whether we're going to create a pivot table on a new worksheet or on the same worksheet. We talked about the pivot table field list, where we can arrange the placement of the fields, which includes the list of the fields, that's our column headers on our data, the drop zones, which include the report filter, the column labels, the row labels, and the values drop zone. We can move the pivot table field list around and undock it from the side. We add fields to the drop zones by left-clicking and dragging them or checking the checkbox. And once we have the fields in the drop zone, we can move them around among the different drop zones. We can clear them from the drop zones by clearing the checkbox or just dragging them back up to the field list. And to delete a pivot table, select it from the Actions group and then press Delete.